Hey guys, I'm just going to go over some common questions that you guys asked on the first two night assignments. So the first one is from the first homework, so from Tuesday's assignment, DL 317, and you guys asked to go over 8 and 9. So let's take a look. Our amplitude is the number that is in front. So on this one, my amplitude is 3. My frequency is the number that's with my x, so in this case is 2. My period, I do 2 pi over my b value, which is 2, which is my frequency, and I get pi. To find range, I want to look at my highest point and my lowest point. Since I have no shifts up or down, I'm really just going to look at my amplitude on this. And my amplitude is 3, so from your x-axis, it's going to go down to -3 and up to +3. Now, before I start graphing this, I am going to just look at finding out my critical value interval. This tells you how to set up your x-axis. My range is how to do my y-axis. Critical value interval is my x-axis. So whatever your period is, so in this case, which is pi, I'm going to take that and divide it by 4. The reason I do this, again, if this is a cosine graph, these critical values, if I cut it into pieces, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 sections to it. So if I want to find where all of those critical values are, I take that period, my length of one cycle, and I divide it by 4. So this is what I'm going to count by. I like to look at what it tells me for my domain. It says from -pi to pi. I first like just counting my positive values. So I'm going to go 0, pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4 would simplify to just pi. So that's how I know when I could stop. This can simplify to pi over 2. 3 pi over 4 stays the same, and pi over 4 stays the same also. So when I list them out, I like to just list out my positive values, and I know that on my axes, the negative values will be the same, just reversed. So let's set up this axis now. So we have to have at least one label somewhere on my x and y axes. So I am going to label first my range tells me my y value. So it's going to go up 3 and it's going to go down 3. My amplitude tells me how high and how low I am going to go. Now I'm going to set up my axes. I'm going to count by 2 boxes. I do not care how many boxes you skip as long as you are consistent and always counting the same. So pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. Now all of those are going to be exactly the same on the other side, except they're going to be negative and reversed. So I have pi over 4 here, then pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. Again, make sure that you're counting 2 boxes every time. And these are all negative. That is the hard part, setting up our axes. Next, what I'd like you guys to do is just create a quick little sketch. So this is cosine. You need to know that cosine starts at its maximum and then comes back around. That's what our one cycle looks like. So I'm going to start on my y-axis, and I'm going to start at its maximum. And every critical value, put another point, put another point, put another point, put another point. And following the maximum, midline, minimum, midline, maximum. And then do the same on the other side. And then you could just connect them. And that is our graph. Again, always just double check you did the correct domain. All right, next one, they want me to graph this over the interval from 0 to 2 pi. So my amplitude is 2, my frequency is 1, my period 2 pi over 1 is just 2 pi. My range, looking at my amplitude, is going to be -2 to 2. Again, there was no shifts up or down, so your amplitude just tells me what my range is. So critical value intervals. I'm going to take my period, 2 pi, and I'm going to divide it and cut it into 4. It's always your period, and divide it by 4, so I get pi over 2. This is how I'm going to count. So pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2. Check your domain. They want you to stop at 2 pi. So simplify these until you get something that is going to stop there. And this could simplify too. So let's set up our axes. And let's label everything that I have. So I'm going to skip a few boxes so my graph's a little more spread out here. And take these values. And label them on my axes. To just be 2 pi. Okay. Lastly, let's label our y-axes. So my range tells me I'm going to go up 2 and down 2. I'm just going to skip 2 boxes. Again, let's be consistent in what we are counting by. Quick little sketch. Sine curve starts at its origin. Well, it starts at its midline, really. In this case, the origin. And I have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 critical values. So once I have that sketch, I have my axes all set up. Now I'm just going to put a point at every critical value. So the first one is at the midline. Put it right there. Then the next critical value, my maximum, midline, minimum, and midline. Connect your points. And you have your graph. Again, make sure that you graphed it over the correct domain. All right, I do want to go over some homeworks from the next one, some questions from the next one as well. You guys asked me for question number 2, so let's look at 2. Sketch at least one cycle of a sine curve. So in your head, you should be thinking of what one cycle looks like. Amplitude of a half, meaning it's going to go up a half, and it's going to go down a half from wherever my midline is, which is at 0. And a period, which is a length of one cycle at 2 pi. So I'm going to start with my midline. Here's my midline. And let's start labeling some things. I know that my amplitude, it's going to go up 0.5 and it's going to go down 0.5. It is a sine curve, so I'm going to start at my origin. I'm going to go up to my maximum, midline. I think I made these a little too big. Let's make them a little smaller. Sorry, maximum, midline, minimum, midline, and this is what my one curve is going to look like. Now, the hardest part is setting up your x-axes, but when they tell you that this is your period, you really only need one label on your x-axes. So if you know your period is your length of 2 pi, I'm going to go like that and just put up 2 pi there. If you really want to label where all of those critical values are, I need to find my critical value interval, so I do 2 pi and I divide it by 4, which gives me pi over 2. So I have pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, and 4 pi over 2. Simplify if you can. So this first critical value would have been at pi over 2. This would have been at pi, and this would have been at 3 pi over 2. Again, you don't need to label all of those, but if you want, that is how you would have done that. My equation of a graph. An equation, make sure you have a y equals. Your amplitude goes in front, so 0.5. This is a sine graph. And then I need to find my b value. My b value is how many cycles in 2 pi, and my period was 2 pi. So there is one cycle in 2 pi. So that would just be a 1, so I don't need to put the 1 and an x. If you don't like doing it that way and you like an equation to help you find what your b value is, you could use your equation for your period, 2 pi over b. The reason why we use this is it has b in it. I'm trying to solve for b. There's b. I could use this equation. So 2 pi over b, and my period is 2 pi. If I cross multiply and solve this, I have 2 pi b equals 2 pi. When I divide by 2 pi, these cancel out, and I get b equals 1. So that is why there really is a 1 here. All right, we export 3 and 4 also. First thing, I like to check for my midline. So if this is all the way up at 3, this is all the way down at 3, there was no shift here, this is my midline. So let's start our equation with a y equals. Your amplitude goes from your midline to your maximum. So in this case, I went up 3 boxes, or you could see how far you went down. So my amplitude is 3. If we look at what type of function this is, I'm starting at the midline. So if I'm starting at the midline, it is a sine curve. But because it's going down first, this is a negative sine curve. Now the last thing you need to do is find your b value. Your b value is how many cycles in 2 pi. So if there's 1 cycle in pi, if I graphed another cycle, it would end in 2 pi. That is one way that you could think of it. Again, if you like to use an equation, then use an equation. Which equation do you know that has b in it? We know this equation, 2 pi over b, which is your equation for the period. So you could set that equal to what your actual period is. If I look, your period is your length of 1 cycle. 1 cycle occurs here in pi. So now I could take this and I can solve this and get me an answer for what my b value is. Put that out over 1. b pi equals 2 pi. If I divide by pi on both sides, I get b equals 2. So in my equation, I'm going to put a 2 and then an x. There are no shifts up or down, so you could leave it just like that. For the second one here, again, my midline is here at the x-axis. If I want to find my amplitude, I'm going from my midline up to the max, so I'm going up 2. So again, start with y equals. I'm going to put a 2 there for my amplitude. Now this is a cosine graph, but it's starting at its minimum, so it's a negative cosine graph. And then your b value is how many cycles in 2 pi. If we look, I have 1 cycle in 2 pi, so this is going to be a 1x, or you could just put the x there. Lastly, you guys want to go over question number 4. This one was a little different. So what I like to do, because this had a shift up, which is what makes it a little different from 3, I like to find where my minimum and my maximum is. Your total distance is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boxes here. So if you cut that in half, that would be 3 boxes, which would mean that my midline is here at 1. So I always like to start with finding where your midline is. Your amplitude is from your midline up to the maximum, or really what half that whole distance is. So that would be 3. So they asked me to find A, which is 3. My b value is how many cycles in 2 pi. If I look at my graph, I have 1 cycle in pi. So if I did another cycle, that would end at 2 pi. If you do not like visually looking at that, then you can set an equation. 2 pi over b equals my period, or my 1 cycle here, is in pi. Put it over 1, cross multiply, b pi equals 2 pi, divide by pi, divide by pi, b equals 2. My c value, if we look at this general form, your c value is what your shift up was. So that's what we did first. We found that midline, which was at 1. They also asked us to write an equation, so let's just write an equation quick. I have y equals, my amplitude is 3. This is a cosine graph because it starts at its maximum. My b value is 2x plus 1. All right, friends, I hope that you found this useful. If you have more questions, please post them in the discussion board. Have a good one. Bye.